There we go. There's a proverb that says, "The righteous man walks in integrity. His children are blessed after him." And we have seen in these first two lessons we've had on Joseph that he really is a man of integrity. He walks his beliefs, and we're going to see in later lessons that indeed his children are blessed. We're in the third week of 4 lessons on in Genesis on Joseph's life story, and we see him as an exemplary man of God, and I think we're going to see that he's also exemplary as a father as well. You know, on Father's Day, I think we have time and again in the New Testament instances where Jesus takes up small children and holds them in his arms, blesses him. Apparently, parents were bringing many children to Jesus to receive a blessing from him, so many that the disciples were, at least on one occasion, concerned that it was taking too much time. But that's one of maybe the most important things we can do as parents is just give kids and grandkids a hug. And I worry sometimes in our modern era whether people are so worried about, predators out there that they don't just give kids hugs. But it's something that we need. It's something that fathers need to do. But the truth is, there's a child in each of us. And there's a vulnerable little part of each of us that wants that hug, wants that affirming, loving, comforting hug of a father, and our Heavenly Father does that for us if we're aware of it, if we will allow Him to. Jesus taught us to pray, "Our Father who art in heaven," but the word is Abba in the language, and it's not a formal father, it's a dad, our heavenly dad, our heavenly papa. That's the prayer. When Paul prays in both Romans and in Galatians, he uses that same term, Abba. And today, like every day, is the day that the Lord hath made. And Father's Day is a day that God has made. I'm not going to belabor the point, but Ephesians 6 says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother is the first commandment with a promise that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on the earth." But then it says, "Fathers, do not exasperate your children." Exasperate, either from indifference towards them or too much attention to them. It says, "Don't exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and the instruction of the Lord." Well, today's a day to thank our dads, thank our grandfathers and fathers, to encourage those dads that are in the tasks now of instructing and training children in the ways of the Lord. But it's also a day to give, as the hymn says, all laud and honor to our Heavenly Father who raises us up. Joseph's story, as I said, is a story of an exemplary man. And it's a good lesson from that point. He's morally an example to us even now, 4,000 years later. He learns and discerns what is right, that he does it. He lives a life of integrity. He's undeterred by circumstances and situations that are most often unjust. And in the end, we'll see that he's forgiving and forgetting of those injustices. And along the way, I think he's an exemplary dad as well. But he didn't get to be that exemplary character because he had perfect parents and grandparents and great grandfathers. I think that's a lesson for us. Joseph was sold into slavery when he was 17 years old. Not only was his father Jacob living, of course, his grandfather Isaac was living. He had lived to that 17 years of age, knowing his grandfather, knowing his father. I think multi-generational in our era, multi-generational families and the influences of multiple generations is shortchanged to a degree. But he learned what was right, and he learned and developed that character at an early age, even though Isaac engendered sibling rivalry between Esau and Jacob, even though his father Jacob was a deceiver and a trickster. And I think there's a good point there. Fathers and grandfathers don't have to be perfect to be used by God to develop their children, hopefully to be better men and women than they are. Joseph, Joseph turns out better in so many ways than either Jacob or Isaac did. But where did he get his start in life? He got it from guys that weren't perfect, but they had a vision of what God wanted their family to be. Anyway, good thing to, as I said, I'm belaboring it, but I think it's an important thing to remember. The second thing that this story does, particularly the last two lessons we've looked at it, is it gives us a real picture of God's providence, God's prevenient grace, that even when we don't recognize that he's taking care of us, he's proceeding in front of us. Wherever Joseph goes, and it's a roller coaster ride, God is always going before him. God's always providing for it. His prevenient grace is there. But a third thing that I think is important as we do this lesson and the next lesson is to recognize as we study this really interesting story, is to recognize how often his experience points to the coming Messiah, points to Jesus's story. Again and again, we see that God takes the one who's rejected or despised and afflicted in many ways and brings about through them salvation of other people. And we're going to see that in Joseph's story. It points to the story of Jesus. The messianic prophecy in Isaiah says that a king is coming who was born despised and rejected by mankind and suffering and familiar with pain. Joseph's rags to riches story is a reminder that Jesus said the last shall be first and the first will be last. Jesus also said anyone who loses his life for my sake will save his life. All of this points, I think, to Jesus, and it's good as we study this lesson and a lot of the Old Testament stories to remember that they're not independent stories. All of the Bible points to this culmination of God's plan in the person of Jesus. Well, as I said, Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers who are jealous of him and hate him when he's 17 years old. They're jealous because he's their father's favorite. His mother, Rachel, is their father's favorite because he has these divine dreams in which God says, this is my plan for you. You're going to be the head of the family. They reject those dreams and they reject the dreamers. They sell him into slavery. In Egypt, Joseph applies himself. We studied last week where it says that God is with Joseph and gives him success. And the people that see Joseph and watch him see that he's successful because God is with him. And then he is maliciously, falsely, wrongfully accused by Potiphar's wife and thrown in prison for it. And in spite of the fact that Potiphar, his master, probably doesn't believe the wife, every indication is if he had, Joseph would have been executed. He's not even thrown into a common prison with common thieves, murderers, and rapists. He's put in the Pharaoh's political prisoner prison that Potiphar himself oversees. But nonetheless, even though probably the household doesn't believe the wife and Potiphar probably doesn't believe the wife, to avoid a public scandal, Joseph is the one who suffers the consequences and is thrown into prison. But he gets into prison, and the jailer appreciates Joseph's talents, just as Potiphar had, ends up putting him in charge of the whole prison. We have, quote, the jailer, quote, thinks highly of Joseph, and soon he's in charge of everything, just as he had been in charge of all of Potiphar's household. Again, we see God's providential hand in all of this. God is with Joseph. It says again, as he's in the prison, Joseph is loyal to his masters. He's diligent and hardworking, applies himself in whatever his present situation is. But he doesn't sacrifice this future for short-term gain in the present. He applies himself, but he doesn't do anything that will rob him of that future that's out there. Joseph is obedient to God at all costs, and in every circumstance. God blesses him, and through him blesses other people as well. So there he is in this prison. He's gone from Potiphar's penthouse to his basement prison, I guess, so to speak. And that's the setting for the lesson we have today. We have a story that ties that last two lessons with this lesson that we have today, and that is found in Genesis 40. And this is the story of the Pharaoh's cupbearer and Pharaoh's baker. Like I said, it sort of is a bridge that ties the two stories together. Let me read a few verses from it. And first of all, the cupbearer is probably his taster, the person that tastes the food. There's a lot of intrigue. We know from historical findings, there's a lot of intrigue in the Egyptian royal families. A lot of coups, overthrows, poisoning of heirs and pharaohs. So whoever is providing the food and drink for a pharaoh has got to be really trustworthy. He's got to be someone who's not involved in the intrigues and the political plotting that goes on. For whatever reason, perhaps there is an attempted coup or something, but for whatever reason, the cupbearer and the baker find themselves in deep water. It says the chief cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was very angry with his two officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the same prison where Joseph was confined. Captain of the guard is how we were introduced to Potiphar, so we can assume that that's the same person. He's in the same prison with Joseph, the same prison, the same household that Joseph worked in. Fourth verse says, the captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended to them. So maybe Potiphar knew that they weren't totally out yet. He didn't want to treat them like, just common prisoners. He puts Joseph in charge of taking care of them. You can imagine that Joseph, who's been up here and is now down here, can relate to these two guys. Easy to see that they may have become friends. They have been in a high place and now they're in prison as Joseph is. It says the two who were being held in prison had a dream the same night. Neither the cupbearer or the baker understood the dreams they had. They had these dreams at night. They were very perplexed by it. Joseph comes in and says, why are you so dejected? And they said, we had these dreams and we can't interpret them. And Joseph says, not, I can interpret your dreams. He says, God can interpret dreams. Tell your dreams to me. And that's what they do. He listens to the dreams. I'm not going to read all the verses. But then he interprets them with God's empowerment. And so he says to the chief cupbearer in the 13th verse, chapter 40, within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position. And you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to when you were his cupbearer. But then the 14th verse, listen to this, he says, but when all goes well with you, remember me. Show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. Then he turns to the baker. Baker tells him his dream, and Joseph tells the baker a very unhappy story. The 19th verse says, "Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift your head from your body and impale your body on a pole, and the birds will eat your flesh." Apparently, the baker was involved in some sort of intrigue here. The 21st verse says, what he predicted comes about. It says, "He restored the chief cupbearer to his position so that once again he put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he impaled the chief baker just as Joseph said to them in his interpretation." Then the 23rd verse says, "The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him." You know, once again, Joseph is mistreated. He does a favor for the cupbearer, and the cupbearer forgets it. You know, I think we all have been somewhere in that deal. I can remember times when there's someone I've done kindnesses to, not looking for reciprocity. You know, you can do somebody a favor, you do them a favor, and then you say, you know, I really need some help here. Can you do me a favor? And they either turn you down or they just don't come through. I think we can all appreciate where Joseph is. He's forgotten by someone that he did a favor for. We all have been someplace where someone could have done us a favor. They could have spoken up for us, squelched a rumor, but it would have taken a little bit of risk on their part, and they just didn't do it. Maybe the cupbearer thought, you know, if I get Joseph out of prison and then he does something to embarrass himself, he'll embarrass me as well. Anyway, for whatever reason, he doesn't do it. It's pretty easy to relate to Joseph in this kind of situation. We've kind of all been there. But in honesty, I have to identify with the cupbearer too. How many times have I said, I'm going to pray for you, and then I forget to do it? Or I'm going to, you know, Spirit moves you, I'm going to call somebody on the phone. I know they're struggling. And then I just get busy and I just don't do it, you know. For whatever reason, the cupbearer forgets Joseph, doesn't do it, goes back to his prior life. But nonetheless, Joseph doesn't let it prevent him from continuing to be usable in his position for the jailer in prison, but usable by God, and God continues to prepare him. You know, I thought this week, 1,000 years later, Daniel finds himself in a very similar situation. He's number 2 to the king of Babylon, just as Joseph is number 2 to the Pharaoh. But the good thing about Daniel's story is we hear his prayers and we have him writing what his state of mind is. And we don't have that with Joseph. We just see what he does. You know, I'd like to hear Joseph pray. You know, I'd like to have Joseph write down in his journal what it is he's thinking, and we could all read it. But I suspect that what he did not pray for was small tasks that fit his powers and his abilities. I think that Joseph's the kind of person who prays for a great power and great abilities to match the tasks that he's given. Joseph's tasks are not one-offs. They're not one-time deals. I think this story is a reminder to us and a teaching to us that God's assignments to us come daily. Sometimes they're big tasks, and sometimes they're just little mundane tasks. Joseph, as I said last week, is a great example of to whom much is given, much is required, but to whom is trustworthy with very little things, they'll be trustworthy with the big things. And if they're not trustworthy with the little things, they won't be trustworthy with the big things. Joseph is trustworthy, he's diligent, he applies himself wherever he is and with whatever the task is that God gives him. He's not defeated, he's not deterred by the situations that arise. And consequently, when the time comes, when God's time comes, Joseph is ready to be used by God. Our lesson today is again a teaching that we're never in control of our situations. We sometimes think we're the captain of our soul, as that poem goes, but we're really not. And we're never in control of what other people do. We're responsible, with God's help, for our response to them. And Joseph is a good example of that. We may be going along and we think that, we're in control, but all it takes is one car swerves in front of you and you're in a car wreck and you got a broken leg, or you go to the doctor and you get a fuzzy spot on your x-ray or something. We're only one heartbeat away from our circumstances being reversed. And this story is a reminder of that our circumstances can change rapidly. But as one of my children used to say, "You're not the boss of me." Well, circumstances are not the boss of me. Circumstances are not our boss. And we have a loving Heavenly Father that's with us in all of them. Our circumstances can put boundaries around us. They put Joseph in a prison, but even though our circumstances may put us in situations where we're not able to do all that we once were able to do. There's a country and western song for that too. But age or illness or being a caregiver, or for whatever reason, we may, "Hey Nancy, y'all come on in, get you a donut hole." We may be put in situations where we're not able to do all that we once were able to do. But Joseph is a good example that even here in prison, he finds work to do that glorifies God and that prepares him for God to use him in an even greater way. And he does 2 years later. The 37th Psalm, I was reminded of this. Let me read a few verses from it because it sounds so much like Joseph, and I wonder when King David wrote this hymn, this psalm, whether he maybe also was thinking about David. First verse says, "Do not fret because of those who are evil, or be envious of those who do wrong." There's various ways that this word fret is translated. It says, don't get upset. It's a way of saying don't dwell in righteous indignation. Don't dwell in victimhood, whatever. Don't fret. Don't be kindled, some translations say. Don't burn. Be cool. Joseph is a cool character in all of this. And he always kept before him that a good and righteous God was in control of all his situations, and in fact all of the world. Second verse says, don't fret, because for like the grass, the evil will soon wither. Like green plants, they'll soon die away. Trust in the Lord and do good. Third verse. Fifth verse, commit your ways to the Lord. Trust in him, and he will do this. He will make your righteous reward shine like the dawn. So be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. Refrain from anger and turn from wrath, and do not fret. It leads only to evil. 16th verse, better the little that the righteous have than the wealth of the wicked. Joseph, again, is a great example of waiting on the Lord, not trying to make something happen, applying himself. In the midst of dealing with the evil that confronts him and confronts people in life, we can sometimes question, why is God letting this happen? Why is this happening to me? I don't deserve this. It's not fair. And why is the person who lies and cheats finding himself at the top of the heap when the person who is ethical is paying for his honesty? But this psalm and the life of Joseph tells us that trusting in God frees us from anger and resentment and allows our righteousness to shine forth. And Joseph is again that example of righteousness shining forth. Even people who don't know his God can see it. God, this story tells us, God is not in these circumstances and these betrayals and mistreatments. God's not punishing Joseph. God's preparing Joseph to be used in a greater way and to receive even greater blessings. than before. The first 13 verses of chapter 41 is where our lesson is today. And it tells the story of the Pharaoh having two very disturbing dreams. I'm not going to read all of these, but I hope that you will read them during the week. But 2 years after the cupbearer is released and restored to the palace, the Pharaoh had these two very disturbing dreams. They're actually the same theme. They're one dream continues on the other. And he has these 7 really fat, handsome cows that are devoured by 7 scrawny, ugly cows that come up out of the Nile. And then he has this dream of 7 very full and heads of grain, and they're swallowed up by 7 heads of grain that are scrawny and dried by the east wind and are devoured by it. And so he's very concerned about this. He turns to his wise men, his dream interpreters, and they can't interpret this dream. They don't know what the 2 dreams mean. And this is also disconcerting to Pharaoh. The Egyptians had a feeling that that dreams were portals to the gods, portals to the future. They built temples where you could go for the very purpose of dreaming. We have records of them keeping dream journals, and they'd pass them down from one generation to another. Dreams are very important to them. They see dreams as a way of interjecting themselves into the activities of the gods without having to die to do it, And so dreams are important, and the dream interpreters of Pharaoh are not able to tell him what these dreams mean, and he's disconcerted by it. Well, the cupbearer is, of course, there, and he remembers that Daniel was able to interpret his dream and the baker's dream. And so he says to Pharaoh, when I was in prison and you were displeased with me, this is what happened. And the dreams turned out just as he told us that they would. Now, you can say that the cupbearer, forgot Joseph until it was to his advantage to remember Joseph. Maybe that's the case. The 9th verse says, has the cupbearer saying, I just remembered my mistake. Maybe he knew, I should have acted on the request. But nonetheless, he brings that to Pharaoh's attention. Pharaoh immediately calls for Joseph to be brought from the prison to come before Pharaoh. So that is what happens. The 14th verse, though, tells an interesting story. It says that he's prepared. He comes and he shaves, which is maybe we don't appreciate it too much, but the Egyptians, they shaved their heads, and facial hair was thought to be really disgusting, and they shaved. On the other hand, the Hebrews thought that their beards were a sign of dignity, and so for Joseph to do this, he's making a cultural concession so that he will be more readily accepted by Pharaoh and the Egyptians when he interprets these dreams. There's a tact. There's a point at which he'll compromise these cultural things. He never compromises his character, his morals. But he is wise enough to come before Pharaoh in such a way that it's easier for Pharaoh to listen to him. Well, this is a very opportune time for Joseph. I can't help, since we've had these lessons about Joseph's father, Jacob, who's the deceiver and the trickster, you can't help but to wonder if Jacob had been in this position instead of Joseph, how this story would have gone down. I can see Jacob saying, hey, Pharaoh, I can tell you what that dream says if you'll just get me out of this prison. Let's just make a deal right here, okay? I can see Jacob doing that. That's not what Joseph does, though. As I said, he got the seeds of his character from his father and his grandfather, but he turns out better than them in so many ways, because what we see here is that although Joseph must surely want out of this prison in the worst way, he wants his freedom. He doesn't mention that in this exchange. He has got all the advantage. Pharaoh thinks that Joseph has a real talent for interpreting dreams, and he desperately wants these dreams interpreted. But Joseph's first concern is not his imprisonment, what's good for him. His first concern is God gets the glory. His God gets the glory. At every stage of his success in prison, in Potiphar's house, everybody knows that it's God that's giving the success, because Joseph must be telling them that that's the case. And he does the same thing with Pharaoh here. The 15th verse, 41st chapter says, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream, but no one could interpret it. Then I heard that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. But just as he told the baker and the cupbearer that God interprets dreams, he corrects the most powerful man in the world. He corrects Pharaoh and gives God the credit. 16th verse says, Joseph answered Pharaoh, it's not me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable response. He doesn't mean that he's going to give him a happy ending response. He's saying, I'll give you a response that will give you peace of mind. The King James Version translates it this way. God will give you an answer of peace, or shalom. Shalom is later translated into the Greek Old Testament as salvation. He'll give you the answer to your dreams, and he'll give you salvation, is what he's really saying. Peace of mind and salvation. So Joseph once again shows his integrity and also his courage. He's standing here in front of the most powerful man in the world. Joseph says, here's another translation. Another translation says it this way: it is beyond my power to do this, but God can tell you what it means and set you at ease. Joseph is humble, gives God all the credit, and Joseph turns this most important fulcrum point in his life, he turns it into an opportunity to have a spiritual conversation about God. And there's a real lesson there for us as well. In just the circumstances and the situations and the events of our life, we have a chance to either work them to our advantage or to give God the credit. We have the opportunity to enjoy our good fortune, or we can turn it into an opportunity to have a spiritual conversation that ends up honoring God. Well, Joseph's entire future is at stake here. He's standing in front of the most powerful man in the world, and he has that guy's attention for good or bad. He's got his attention. And he must have approached it with at least some trepidation. He's too smart not to. But he also knows that God has put him in a critical position, and God would not put him in that position if God didn't didn't go with him. He's not going to be abandoned by God in this. And so Joseph's trust and confidence in God enabled him to be very bold in standing before Pharaoh. The 25th verse says that Joseph confirmed to Pharaoh that Pharaoh was wise to be worried about these dreams, because they are in fact prophetic. And so he says, you're wise to be concerned about this. Again, sort of appealing to him. And then the 28th verse says, it's just as I told Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. 7 years of abundance, he's interpreting these dreams now, 7 years of abundance are now coming throughout the entire land of Egypt. After them, 7 years of famine will appear, and all the abundance of the land of Egypt will be forgotten. The famine will devastate the land. No one will remember the abundance of the land, because the famine that will follow will be so severe. The two dreams, he also says later, you got these two dreams because God has made up his mind about this. This is going to happen, and it's going to happen soon. That's why you have the two dreams. And here's what they mean. So Joseph tells him what they mean, And, I thought when I was reading this the first time a couple of weeks ago, Joseph could have said, got it, let's quit here. Let's quit while we're ahead. Here, I answered your dreams. I know you appreciate it. Let me out of prison, and I'll just go back to Canaan, or I'll live here in the palace with you. But he doesn't do that. He's given an interpretation of the dreams. It doesn't say that God said, now you tell Pharaoh, here's a good plan for him to follow. He's proven himself as an administrator and a leader, and he sees that there needs to be a plan. And he comes up with this plan because God has prepared him to do that. I think this lesson here, there's a lesson for us. Again, Joseph is a great example for us. Give God the credit. Give God the glory for every good and perfect gift, for all the providential care, for all the answered prayer. He's an example of that. But there's also, I think, a lesson in here for us that there is a time. There is a propitious time to act that God gives us. And here he's telling Pharaoh, this terrible famine is coming, but you've got time. You've got 7 years to prepare for it and the ability to prepare for it. And there's a time. 2 Corinthians 6:2 says, for he has said, in the time of my favor I heard you, and in the day of salvation I helped you. I tell you, now is the time of God's favor. Now is the day of salvation. Daniel, that I mentioned, he interprets for the king of Babylon the writing on the wall. And what it says is, your judgment's coming tonight. It's too late for you. There's a time when it's too late. We don't know when that is. God only knows when that is, but there's a time when it's too late to act on God's grace. And one of the things that this story teaches is when God's time is there, don't miss it. Don't miss it. There's a great there's a great old revival hymn that says, almost persuaded, come today. Almost persuaded, turn not away. Jesus invites you here. Angels are lingering near. Prayers rise from hearts so dear. O wanderer, come. And then it says, very sadly, almost persuaded, harvest is past. Almost persuaded, doom comes at last. Almost cannot avail. Almost is but to fail. Sad, sad that bitter wail, almost but lost. Pharaoh could have missed this opportunity, but he doesn't. He acts on it. At every stage we see Joseph, he has an opportunity to make a choice, and he makes the right one. Pharaoh could have reacted to the interpretation of these dreams, been angry, and rejected the interpretation of the dreams, just as Joseph's brothers rejected the dreams he had back in Canaan, and he could have punished the messenger for it. That was the risk that Joseph took. But what Joseph told Pharaoh is what Pharaoh must surely have known. He's the most powerful man in the world, but he can't control the floods of the Nile River. And they live, that is their sustenance. They live, they rise and fall with the floods of that river. When Ann and I went to Egypt, they only have 2 words for earth. One is soil and the other is desert. And if you go there, you'll see it's just as stark as the difference between a white wall and a dark floor. There's the dark soil, and then there's like a line, and it's just desert. Where that water, when the water's not available, you can see how they could have a famine. Well, he says to Pharaoh, you have time. Here's a plan for you. You have 7 years. It is going to be such an abundant 7 years that you can set aside more than enough grain to sustain the entire country for those 7 terrible years of famine. And if you're going to do that, you're going to have to act now and act decisively, and you're going to have to do things differently. You're going to have to put someone in charge that goes and taxes more than they usually are taxed, but actually takes a fifth of all of the produce and sets it aside. And Pharaoh does that. The 37th through the 43rd verse says that this practical wisdom was seen by Pharaoh and his advisors as wise. And Pharaoh who's a man who's accustomed to making decisions of real import, makes a decision that Joseph is the man to be put in charge of this new job that is given. And so Joseph is given the symbols that are associated with this new authority and this new position that he's going to have. He gets Pharaoh's signet ring. He can issue orders in Pharaoh's name. He's given linen clothes that royalty would wear, a gold necklace. He's given a chariot, sort of like a Bentley or a Rolls Royce. It's the number 2 chariot in the land. He goes through a parade, and Pharaoh has everybody shout, "Attention! Pay attention to Joseph." And so Joseph is suddenly in charge of Egypt. He is in charge. The 44th and 45th verse are his official swearing in, and Pharaoh declares the authority and the extent of authority that Joseph is given. He gives him a wife of the appropriate social standing. She's the daughter of a priest of On. Interestingly, archaeologists believe they have found Joseph's palace in On because it has hieroglyphics that say, "I gathered corn, held it in times of prosperity, and in many years of famine doled it out." They believe they've found it. But anyway, he is given a wife of that appropriate standing, and he's given an Egyptian name. He is second in command to Pharaoh. It's not unusual in Egypt in this time, or in Babylon 1,000 years later, for slaves to be given very important jobs, but this is unprecedented. This is a new position. This is number 2 to Pharaoh, above generals and governors, and so it's unprecedented. Joseph, though, knows that he didn't win the lottery so that he could take great vacations and live in the lap of luxury. Joseph knows that this has all come his way because God has a plan for him, and that is to use him to bless other people. He's not being rewarded for his faithfulness so that he can just enjoy the reward. God has come to use Joseph to save his family and to save many, many families in Egypt and in surrounding countries. The 46th through the 52nd verse say, so Joseph becomes second in command. He's 30 years old. He was 17 when he was sold into slavery. He's been in one prison or another for 13 years, almost half his life. He could have thought, I've wasted the best years of my life. He could wallow in self-pity. He could have been embittered against his brothers, Potiphar's wife, the cupbearer. He could have resultingly have been of no use to anybody, including himself. But he believes that God is with him. He experiences God is with him. He applies his wisdom and administrative abilities, and he becomes a divine blessing to his family and to everybody else too. He does not, once he becomes number 2 in the land, live a life of luxury and desolate living in Pharaoh's palace. It says, 46th verse, that he travels throughout all the land of Egypt, and he sets up this mechanism for building storehouses and collecting grain. It says that he, quote, amassed grain that was beyond measuring. He quit even trying to count how much grain he was setting aside in these storehouses because the abundance was so great. And during this time, Joseph's and his wife are blessed with 2 children, two sons. Here we see Joseph has a heathen wife. He lives in a heathen kingdom. He lives in a culture that is idolatrous and unaware of the true God. And nonetheless, he maintains his childhood faith in the God of his fathers, his Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and he maintains his belief. He has these two sons, and he names them in such a way that reflects his understanding. For these last 13 years, he may not have understood, why did this happen? Why did this happen? Why did this happen? But now he begins to see the pieces of the puzzle put together, and it makes a picture. He has two sons. The oldest is Manasseh. Manasseh means God made me to forget. He made me to forget, enabled me to forget all my trouble I had in my father's household. Sometimes we forgive, but we just don't forget. Sometimes I think forgetting is a more powerful term. I'm going to talk more about forgiveness in next week's lesson. But I love the story about Clara Barton, who started the Red Cross, and she in the American Civil War was trying to get nurses and go into hospitals, and women just did not do that. They didn't go into these hospitals. Men were in pain, they were naked, all that sort of stuff. She got a lot of opposition. Speeches were made by senators against her. And one of these senators was about to be appointed to an ambassadorship one time, and a friend of Clara Barton says, this is your chance. All you've got to do is just remind the president of the terrible things that he said about you. And Clara Barton says, I don't remember that. She said, yeah, you have to remember that. Don't you remember he said yada, yada, yada? And she said, I don't remember that. And she says, yes, you do. And she says, no, I don't. I specifically do remember forgetting it. Well, sometimes forgetting is more powerful than even forgetting. And so he names Manasseh, God made me able to forget. He doesn't forget in a negative way. It's not that he doesn't long, I'm sure, to be held in the arms of this doting father that he had that so favored him. But he's able to not be bitter about it. He's not bitter toward the wrong that his brothers did. He sees, and we'll talk about this next week, that although the brothers meant it for his harm, God intended it for his good. And he sees that here at this point in his life. The second son is named Ephraim, which means fruitful. God had given him prosperity and blessed him, and he names the son in recognition of that. It's not just that he receives these accoutrements of blessings, but he also is given the peace to be satisfied with where he is. He's not back home. He's not with his father, but he's able to be satisfied and happy with what he has and where he is, because he sees that that's God's plan for him. He was able to put the past behind him one more time. We're about out of time, but there's a couple of things that I think are interesting in this. And one is, we have these stories like this. We always have to put them in the larger context. And I think it's interesting to contrast Joseph, who lived these events, with Moses, who writes them down. Everything that we're studying was written down by Moses, who wrote down the 5 first books of the Old Testament. Joseph was in his father's pasture. He's thrown into a pit by his brothers and sold into slavery. He finds himself in Potiphar's house, and he ends up being in the top floor. He's management in Potiphar's house. And then he's thrown into prison by Potiphar. And then Pharaoh raises him up from the prison to the palace, number 2 in the land. On the other hand, Moses is, because of, as Pastor Jeff told in his sermon last week, Moses, through the actions of his sister and his mother, finds himself in the palace and is raised in the palace as a son, as a grandson of the Pharaoh. But then he is brought low and humble, and he finds himself out in the Sinai being a shepherd to his father-in-law's sheep. I think that, there's a lesson in that. The purposes of God in elevating Joseph from the pasture to the palace so that he could save his family. We're going to see 70 people. That's his family. 70 people do not succumb to the famine and come to Egypt, and he saves them. But he also saves a lot of Egyptians as well. Moses, on the other hand, leaves the palace, goes to the pasture, so that he could then follow God's plan and lead a whole nation of Israelites out of Egypt into the promised land, out of that bondage. God's purposes are not always, God doesn't follow one set pattern. Sometimes he raises people up to fulfill his purposes, and sometimes he brings people low so that they can be used to achieve his purposes. And the end result is that Joseph is able, God is able to use Joseph to bless not only his own family, but many people. I thought that then one other thing I wanted to mention, because I thought it was an interesting point I'd never thought of before, but the person who wrote the materials in the student book says, what a shame, that Pharaoh is exposed to the God of Joseph, and he missed the opportunity to become a follower of God. And I guess that's right. He had a very rudimentary understanding of Yahweh at this time, but surely by the end of this 14 years, he had a lot better understanding. And maybe he did to some degree, except we don't know, but certainly Egypt did not become a God-fearing, a Yahweh-fearing nation. Pastor Jeff told the story last week, there came after 400 years, a Pharaoh who didn't remember Joseph and enslaved them and came up with a narrative that fit what it was that he wanted to do. But I do think it's interesting to note that individuals were impacted by Joseph's story. There were Egyptians and other people who did become followers. There's an interesting line, not in our lesson today, but that makes this point. Pharaoh maybe didn't become a follower of God, but he recognized that God's Spirit was on him, on Joseph, and God had a vision for him and his people. He gave him an Egyptian name that means God speaks and lives. So he had some recognition. Other people in Egypt at the time also recognized this. And maybe he missed it, but all didn't. Exodus 12:38, 400 years later, the family of Joseph is leaving the bondage of Egypt, and they are leaving on their way to the promised land to receive the 10 commandments, to cross the Red Sea, to take possession of the promised land. But when they leave Egypt, it says that a diverse crowd also went up with them. It's translated in some places, other people, non-Hebrews, went with them. There were people, if you remember the 10 Commandments, Charlton Heston is leading them out. Charlton Heston's adoptive Egyptian mother goes with them. Other Egyptians went with them. The nation of Egypt maybe didn't become God followers, but individuals did. And I think that in a great way makes the point that God's expansive grace is available to all. If you will take that propitious time and act on it. A lot of Egyptians did. A lot of non-Hebrews did. We talked about Tamar, the Canaanite, who along with Rahab and Bathsheba and Ruth that we're going to study in this quarter, took their opportunity to accept God's grace and incorporate them not only into the Hebrew people, but into the lineage of Jesus himself. The same with Pharaoh's daughter, Moses' adopted mother. That expansive grace is available. Anyway, out of time. Anybody else got something else they want to add? It's again a great story, and not quite the soap opera that we had in last week's episode, but it's a great story, and it's a really great story next week. I hope you'll read the next chapter where his brothers come to Egypt, don't recognize him, and one of the questions you're going to have next week is, why did Joseph sort of play the games that he did with his brothers? And I think you'll come to the same conclusion. He's not being mischievous or there's not an element of payback in this. Sometimes we find out our own hearts, the repentance or lack of repentance by some trials. And I think that you're going to see in next week's lesson, Joseph, he plays this little game of identity, keeps his identity secret from them just long enough so that they learn something about themselves. Anyway, that's next week's lesson. Anything else? Let's close with a word of prayer then. Thanks. Yeah. Loving God, we depend on you regularly for your grace. Unfortunately, we don't always recognize it. We thank you for it. We thank you for the grace and providence that are afforded us. And in Jesus' name, we give you all the praise and glory for it. And we ask you in this coming week to open our eyes and let us see and connect the dots of the things that you do for us that are for our own good and for our own benefit, because you have plans for us that are beyond our imagination. It's in Jesus' name we give you all that praise and glory. Amen.